Hello, everyone. How are we? Hope everyone is doing great. I know we are. Before we start, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Irina Lakicevic, and I'm an artist.
And my name is Christian.
And I think I'm not entirely unknown to the world. I think most of you know me as a fashion influencer. That 5 years ago, 4 years ago,
4 years seems accurate.
yeah, 4 years ago, completely disappeared from social media, apart from a couple of sporadic inserts, but has completely disappeared from social media in order to focus on art. And I think that this is where the story starts.
Yeah, I think that is the goal for today.
Yeah, and Christian here, he's going to be a great Christian, and he's going to help me speak about these things. I'm not sure what form this thing will take because we are filming it as we go.
Yeah, I think we're gonna try out a bit of open conversation and we're gonna speak a bit about what you've been doing lately and what led to those things happening.
Yes, I think that's a very accurate description because I started. Most of you know me as an influencer. However, somebody who has graced pages of Vogue, always best, I'm not going to say always, but definitely best dressed street style,
In my opinion, always best dressed.
All right, thank you for that. And although what I love about art is that they mentioned that it is led by the unspokenness in a sense. Not always, not for everyone. Obviously, art is a very vast field. However, part of my practice, I kind of realized that there's this dimension where I want to develop linguistically, but also where I have all of these interesting thoughts that you and me quite often talk about. And I think it's kind of interesting to put them out in the world to see what the resonance is going to be. One of the reasons is I have, in a sense, such a unique position between worlds. And my own transition, led through my own practice, is something that highlights a road very few people have taken. And I want to utilize this space to highlight some of my narrative, why I think it's important, how I think it's important, and what that narrative means in a wider scope, in wider sense of the.
I think that makes sense. So where would you like to start with it? Should we start a bit early in your life if there's any events or anything there that has colored your road towards getting into art, or do you want to start later on?
Actually, I think it's a very good question because I think where do you start your narrative as an artist? When do you become an artist? And I think it's an interesting question of whether you're born one or whether you're made one. And within my dimension, maybe being born one is rather rather the.
So you feel that resonates more with you, that
Yeah.
you were already ready to be formed into an artist whilst born.
Well, I think the narrative definitely starts when I was born because I'm born on 23rd of August, and that is between the day of the cusp between Leo and a Virgo. And I think why is that interesting? Because already there's this dimension of a split that kind of pervades my whole narrative, my whole work. That is kind of a happening because I'm born on the day when Leo goes over to Virgo, and where the ruler, in a sense, goes over to a servant. Virgos are maidens of knowledge.
It's quite hard science you're bringing on board here to start this off, but I like how it is.
Although I have to say, art is really plunging into science nowadays. It's starting to look to me as it has the same complex as fashion does, because fashion has a bit of artistic complex, and I feel art has a bit of a scientific context nowadays, and I understand how it kind of pans out and why it does. So we're going to speak about it, but let's go back to a narrative. And I'm also born cross-eyed, so that essentially means that with different strengths of on both of my eyes, and I'm farsighted. So what that kind of essentially means is that my left and my right side of the brain never managed to synchronize in a sense over.
So what you're saying is that your brain hemispheres have different sensorial inputs.
Yes.
That you get you get different signals to different parts of your brain all of the time.
Yes. And it's pretty accurate. So you kind of already from the day I was born, I have this dimension of a split where there is this lacking synchronization in a sense. And I'm reluctant to say lacking, but it's definitely a synchronization
I think that
mishap.
I think that a fair thing to say is that most people will have a more succinct worldview at the start, where their senses is functioning with more of sameness on the senses, whilst you have had a very different perception. Like you have had different inputs throughout your first years and your years after, which is very formative in how you perceive and how you build your worldview.
I mean, sorry guys, I'm a bit nervous today. I don't know why, because we have done this couple of times already. This is our like third or fourth take. Not on this episode. We've kind of filmed a bit things here and there, so I'm a bit nervous.
There's a few episodes that we've tested out that will be released later.
But I think what is fascinating with, as you say, like with the first formative years, is the fact that I'm so far-sighted at +3.5. Things start looking as an abstract painting. So my eyes have never been used to this sharpness of visual experience that I think most of the people have. However, since I had to wear glasses from early on, I kind of have that like split coming up into my life again, where the glasses provide a sharp narrative. Like I can perceive things visually sharp as normal people do. However, on the sides, I see blurry. So kind of I have like the distinction kind of going back and forth within already early in my existence, in my experience.
Was there any other treatments that you went through for this that might have even made this split even more distinct?
Yes, I used to have an eye patch. So in order to oh my god, I need to find the photo. It's a very good photo. I used to wear an eye patch on one and on the other eye because they weren't synchronized in order to activate my muscles. So I was like a pirate from very early on, and my parents loved Annie Lennox, so I had the short hair. And to kind of continue that narrative, that again builds upon the dimension of a split, is that on the day when they tried to baptize me,
emphasizing tried in this.
Yes, I hit a head on the church restaurant door, which is also quite important for the later narrative. I thought it was church door, but it was a church restaurant door, which kind of makes the narrative even more powerful in my eyes. And I had to, which led to me having a horizontal split on my forehead, as a memory of that attempt. So I think already from the onset, my experience has never been unified to an extent where other people's usually has. And this multidimensionality was something that I was always fascinated by, because we as systems are as such, and I think there are many people that would kind of contribute to this thought, we are a sum of the inputs that has created us up to a certain point. Yes.
Are you talking about all the inputs that creates us into the being, or are you talking about subsystems making up the whole systems of a human being, as in organically?
Well, I guess both and. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. However, I think what is interesting with us is that we have like this genetic part, so our bodies and the cells and the memory they carry within, and then we have our consciousness. So I think it's interesting how my consciousness already from the onset is split, and that lacking unified reality is something that has made me hyper aware of the ability of the system on its own to morph, to change, to move, etc., etc. So I think that question, like, do you become an artist or you made one? I think in my from the very onset, on existence, my own experience already bears with it so many questions about the nature of our experience, the nature between the system and its user, in a sense that I sometimes think that it kind of becomes a really interesting discussion in the context of free will. And also really interesting discussion. It does. Like,
yes,
did I ever have a choice?
First episode. Let's do free will.
Yes, please. But but this is what I'm telling you. And with my mother, who's a neurologist and psychiatrist, or was before the war, and my father, who was an economist, who works for this. He was a marketing director of a very large complex in Serbia, or on Kosovo. So I think already there you have an artist in making.
You have a lot of fuel for it, at least.
Yes, because like I think it's quite beautiful to think about it, because not only have I this very morphable existence or experience, visual experience, in the sense that, like, when I have glasses, everything is sharp. When I don't have glasses, everything looks like a abstract painting. But also growing up with mother, who's a neurologist and psychiatrist, does definitely it brings with it the promise of understanding of self-analysis and analysis of everything else around you.
I feel that you might have been presented with multidimensionality at a very early age, both in between, maybe. Like, all children will have to go through feedback from their parents, how they perceive things, what is being perceived, etc. But I would believe that with your mother and her background, you might have seen this to a higher degree, and that connected with how you see the world, and you have this multidimensionality where you can look to the side and you have one viewpoint, you have forward, you have one, and then you're mixing it up with sometimes covering up one eye and sometimes covering up the other.
Yes.
And you have different strengths on your eyes as well.
Yes,
so which means that your brain is having a different way of mapping the world every second day.
Yes, and I think it's kind of interesting. I think about it almost like in the context of horoscopes. I'm not sure who believes in horoscopes, but in a sense I do. But as a context of a memory structure, I'm a Virgo with the moon in Capricorn. So I'm on the cusp between Leo and a Virgo with the moon in Capricorn. But my experience, given the understanding of the through the constant psychoanalysis, early understanding of the feedback loop, and like that whole dimension has definitely led me to be very, very curious about how the system works. I think like I have this eternal morphability in a sense. So I have Leo, Virgo, Capricorn, and an inner Aquarius thing happening. So it kind of makes for a fun concussion.
Yeah, there's definitely a hotspot of dimensions and different inputs there.
So, we kind of are going back to the free will. Did I ever have a choice in becoming an artist? Like, my father coming from this like hyper analytical but also hyper political background. It's
I want to say no, but it's definitely it has more inputs in than what we have been talking about. It goes more to your all your interests, all the different things you have been undertaking. I think for you to becoming an artist is probably one of the more logical ways and the more correct ways for you personally to take, because it's the best way for you to unfold all of those interests in one place.
yes, yes. And so that's kind of the first 3 years of my life, and I think the narrative kind of gets just goes further down the rabbit hole, because at the age of 11, the war starts in Serbia, and one is it's very difficult to describe that state without using very strong and very horrific language at the same time. But at the same time, I kind of exist within the split. It's my story, and I'm not shying away from it. But at the same time, do I want to put that narrative into this context? We can.
I think the narrative, I do understand what you're saying, but the narrative is definitely having an effect on what happens later and what forms you. So the narrative will always be a part of this context.
Exactly. Like, I mean, thank you for that. Because I think even the war has such an interesting dimension. Interesting is
it has a force dimension of something that you as a child or an 11-year have no control over.
But it has, yes, exactly. But it also kind of it brings about this narrative where not only have you seen and experienced horrific things. I was 13 when I was attempted assaulted, and not very far from that event, I watched one of the people closest to me have an attempt at. Yes, but what happens when you grow up in a scenery where the darkness is the only thing that you experience, and that darkness has been brought upon fellow human beings? What do you how like that has definitely deeply affected my relationship to social dimensions of existence. So, and also what happens when the only language that you brought in is the one that, again, only is utilized to describe these horrific events. So, if we kind of think about the system and the exposure, etc., and then me coming to London and then seeing how a lot of things have panned out, it becomes really interesting to observe one's existence through that lens, through that looking glass, like where you kind of see this accumulation of pure human darkness in one form or the other, either on the one that like through the war has been forced upon you, and on the other side, when the people that have experienced these levels, what are the stories they're going to tell? I think a lot of stories that have been told are brave ones, are happy ones. People hold on to that, but at the same time, they are very deeply laced with this bitterness and sorrow, and you grow up in that, and many people have, and already from the onset, one starts, especially with my background and my experience, one becomes really interested in how things intertwine and how A becomes B and how it ties to C. Because my whole experience, especially the visual one in the early years, has kind of made me aware. First, it has made me hyper vulnerable. So I wasn't very I was very active, but I wasn't a very social child. In the sense, it has made me quite vulnerable. But in the sense, it has also allowed me to sense past the visual experience, And I think that's the dimension that has ultimately made me an artist, this ability to sense past the visual and really emphasize things that we would encompass with words as intuition, gut feeling. So if my eye wasn't very discerning, my mind definitely was from the very early age, for better and for worse, to be honest.
Which is very interesting because when I met you, I know you as a person with a very discerning eye as well. Which is very interesting how all of these three things has sort of become a strength, even though, as you say, your visions have had quite a lot of challenges on it.
So yes, maybe that's one of the reasons why. Like maybe that is like why I like staring at the things until they're not the things that you're staring, or at least until they stare back at you. But and I think how all of this kind of starts panning out is very fascinating, because at the age of 15, I was 15, I turned 15 1 week after arriving in the refugee camp in Norway. So my father, I now I can imagine the strength that he has to undertake such a journey. But then again, the war has left us with almost nothing, and he undertook such a strong journey that kind of brings us to Norway, and where we have spent 4.5 years as refugees. And I think you and me met like a year after we got the permission to stay. Yeah,
I think we met the year you got the permission.
yeah, permission of residency. So what happens is that we arrive in Norway, but then it's kind of like the schooling question, and me and my brother managed to learn Norwegian within a year of our arrival, to such an extent that I was allowed to go to the high school, in Norwegian high school, because that was not the usual route.
It is, especially within a year, it is not supposed to happen, and you actually had to apply for a special permit to be allowed into high school, right?
Yes, that's very true. So what that means, people hear these narratives and you're like, oh, okay, cool, that happened, great, that happy thing, like, but at the same time that means that you had to put out all your hurt, everything that has ever happened to you aside, and just focus on one thing. And I think linguistically and like mentally it becomes also a very interesting dimension, because at the age of 15, 16, 17, where people starting really socializing and being introduced to a society as adults, in a sense.
It's very formative and developmentally important years for young youth to step into and start developing into adults.
Yeah, so my one is reduced at the same time. One is reduced to um, a very infantile stage, where language, which is at this particular point in one's life supposed to help out with understanding intricacies, social games, etc., etc., all of those dimensions that kind of pan out during those years. One is reduced to a very infantile stage where ability to communicate is hyper limited.
You basically have to start all over, because first of all, you have a different language, but also the country you went to is very different from the country that you came from. So the social norms and like the symbolism, how people communicate with the non-verbal communication is highly different.
Yes. I mean, if you can take Serbia is as far as one comes, far away from Norway, because Serbia kind of starts entering the South European territory, and South and North are very different regions and very different dimensions of communication. And I think this is actually a bit of a funny story. Let's kind of lighten up the mood a bit. In Serbia, the way one communicates and how one creates bonds is through this dimension of talking about oneself and one's own experiences. And I see Christian laughing already.
It's important to share.
Yes, it's very important to share. It's very important, and people that kind of know how to engage within those realms are the ones that are in high esteem. And however, when you live in Norway, that is not the route you want to take.
It's not necessarily where you start.
No, no. Oh, yes, no. I mean, that's not where you start, because the way the Norwegian customs of social introduction and social dances, the dimension they operate within is very far removed from talking about yourself. You actually learn how to ask questions about the other. You engage with the other first before you implement your own narrative. And that's not something that you understand. That's not something you understand when you arrive, and especially that's not something that you're even thinking of when you arrive. When we arrived in Norway, I turned 15 in a refugee camp. And I say turned 15 because, like, in this transitional camp, afterwards, the refugees camp in Norway changed a bit, but this was transitional camp that was also quite dangerous, to be honest. So it was such a bizarre experience, and yet I managed to push through to learn Norwegian, to get the highest grades. I was a straight A student in Serbia, and I was almost a straight A student in Norway. So you kind of that split is interesting. Again, it kind of comes about again because I have closed everything that I was or have been, and then adopted this new personality, the one that kind of didn't seem to have that past that we are speaking of now, and that I became aware, I think, when we came to London. We met the year I started studying dentistry. So the year that we were granted the permission of residence was the year I was admitted to dentistry. So I studied dentistry for 5 years, and we met the first year.
So what basically happened is that you came to Norway at 15, you finished up pre-high school, and then you got into high school after a year coming to Norway, finished that in 3 years. And this is also, just to put a bit into the narrative, when you get to Norway, you get placed and allocated to a location, and you guys were quite far north in the country at a place called Sandnessjøen. Beautiful nature, but very different from, again, where you came from, because now you're in a town of, let's say, 6,000 people.
Yes, I think 8,000 together with the neighboring islands. But it was such a dramatic climatic change as well. But I think I have to say, I have to give a shout out to the people in Sandnessjøen. Classmates there have provided such a warm welcome. I mean, obviously, I was never part of the society in that sense. However, compared to what I've experienced later on throughout different dimensions of existence, never mind. The people in Sandnessjøen have been so warm, and I want to give them a shout out. You're cool. But yes.
And then after finishing high school, 3 years there, you got into dentistry in Bergen.
Yes, and I started dentistry for 5 years. And just to kind of, to those who are wondering, I worked as a dentist for 4 years approximately. And I think I want to bring this into narrative, and that is that my master thesis in dentistry was on social economic aspects of the dental health. So how the social economic factors impact the dental health. So already from, like, you kind of, although there is a split, there is this dimension of what is the word of merging of even my past, my past kind of pervading my present, which is obviously not surprising, but I had to put very hard and very strong barriers to be able to do what I've done in order to segregate everything that has happened, not only to me but to that whole dimension of devastation and lack, betrayal of faith in humanity from the early onset, to be able to push through in such a way.
Well, in many ways, you're like when you're 15, you very often have a very naive worldview, and yours has been shattered at this time, and you have basically been working very hard for existence for about 5 to 6 years at this point to get into a position where you can secure a good place in society.
Exactly, and I mean there is one no, oh, all of those gorgeous things that kind of people go through their childhood, through those teenage years, all the like the fights, the boyfriends, all of that. Everything was pervaded by a very different narrative for me. But it's very fascinating to me to speak about these things now, and yet know that you only know me as this girl that has definitely conquered the fashion world and reached the stars in many ways, before seemingly giving it all up. While I've existed in both spheres, not being aware how these spheres are touching and merging into each other. And I think when I became a dentist was the first time I could start reflecting upon my life or even breathe for a second. And not that I allowed that to myself.
You worked well, not to put too much story around it, but in Bergen, since there is a university there, it's not the easiest place to even get a job as a dentist when you're freshly out of university. So first of all, we were living in Bergen, and you were working very hard, and to get positions, to get established. So yes, I wouldn't say that you definitely probably had a bit more off time, but your shoulders didn't really sink as deep as they probably should have.
No, and it's very, again, like we're discussing free will. I've been from the very onset being graced by my father's energy, which for better and for worse, my father is absolute force of nature. And I've been granted his energy. But however, I never felt, and sometimes it felt like I mastered that energy. But however, upon coming to London and having all these reflections and experiences I've had, I've just understood that it feels like I I have been rather the manifestation of that energy that has been pulled by it, rather than being the one that has been able to navigate it in a sense, because it feels so arbitrary after the life I've had that you leave it all and you come to London and you want to start a fashion career. But before we go to London, I think, so a year into my working as a dentistry, or a year something?
Yeah, I think about a year into it.
Yes. I started developing a blog. I am fascinated by fashion. I was fascinated by fashion. Now I have to say that I love fashion, but I'm not.
You were very much enamored by it when I met you. Like, fashion was a very big part of you. Even though, of course, due to the way that we have already described, the road that has been that you have walked, you didn't necessarily have the access to fashion that a lot of people might have had, but you were definitely immersed in it.
I think it's such a fascinating act. It's a fascinating act that repeats itself constantly on a global scale, that we all conjointly are immersed in. And it's a creative act, and it's an act of self-expression, and it acts as its own measure, and I find that's very fascinating to me. I have to say that I think like it becomes this whole road of something being a measure of something is, I think it's almost like a treacherous road that every artist walks. It's a very thin line between using something to put boundaries as to how something pans out, and on the other side, using something as an indicator of something, like how something is alike something. And I know this is a bit of a different discussion, but I really enjoyed fashion, and fashion is at the same time the closest that I would have come to art, because given the nature of the analysis that my mind really enjoyed, fashion was something that I could observe constantly without necessarily having the language to contextualize or communicate with other individuals. It's something that I was able to observe just in quiet, how it panned out for my classmates, for people around me, through different areas throughout the places we have lived. Also, how different it is between like Serbia at that point and Norway, because in Serbia people have really been enamored with the fashion that is very current right now. It's kind of like the golden stage of I think it's kind of one of those golden stages of human existence between 1994 to 2001, 2, 3, something like that, where fashion just kind of goes into a very fascinating dimension to me that I absolutely adore. And while in Norway, just due to the climate, that is not something that is very important. And also how image, bodily perception, etc., pan out in South Europe and Northern Europe is very different. So kind of just already there from the very onset, I was very drawn to the visual dimension of the experiential manifestation. And I will in due time elaborate on those words. But it's also the closest to art that I've ever been. And I think it's not before we came to London that I understood that fashion, in my mind, how it is very far from the fashion industry as it operates. And I think that's where my narrative as an artist that I am now starts.
Yeah, because it seemed to me that though I never doubted your love for fashion, it seemed to me that it was more you expressed yourself perhaps like an artist through fashion in many ways.
Exactly, but and when we came to, so I've been influencing for a couple of years, and I hope everyone is feeling very nicely influenced. I know you do. I know that it's very fascinating to observe that due to like I was one of the early influencers, not the earliest, but definitely in the early stages of all of this. And it's very fascinating to see how me and a couple of girls, like the amount of impact that we have made on the society, like how we have existed as those links between at that point fashion was very elitistic and very secluded, but also those links between those levels and the more and the more globalized community. And I think that's why I think that is also part of the why this podcast has manifested itself. It is because I serve as an interesting link between dimensions, and my experience acts as such, and it's something that I think would be very, it's going to be interesting to see its resonance.
I agree.
Yeah, so I've been influencing for a couple of years, and things were going quite well.
And that is primarily what brought us to London.
Exactly. So I quit my job as a dentist 5 years ago, and we moved to London. And I will have to say I was not prepared for the. I thought that I was. You kind of always think that you are prepared for things.
Yeah, but once again, if we talked about you having societal changes, this is definitely the third societal change that you experienced.
And I think in many ways the most extreme one that is also in many ways, because I think that there's so many dimensions of existence in a bigger city that people, yes, I mean it's a whole Alice in Wonderland experience without people even understanding why it is so. I don't think anybody who has not lived in a big city can. It's very difficult to comprehend that experience.
In many ways, it is fairly obvious on a base intellectual level
Yes.
to see that it is as such, but you have to have lived there and maybe been between places where it isn't as such to see how big that gap is between them. Because it's pretty clearly stated already through science, etc., that the more people you have together, the more ideas, the more, in many ways, the more effective human beings becomes into coming up with new ideas, which also means that the people participating in this will develop. Now we'll go over to my view on it, but will develop on a different level than people from less than people from other places.
I think it's also very interesting to think about, but we will discuss this in the next episode, I think, how it pans out in the context of time. And I will just give you that little cute clue, and I will leave you with that. What cultural epicenters, conglomeration of people within a hotspot or less density of people, how is that connected to time and what does it mean? So I'll leave you with that nugget. But why art? And we come to London, and I think I have this absolute epiphany that ultimately also broke me. I think when I saw the harshness of the world, it pulled me straight back to the narrative that I have worked very hard to put barriers against. But seeing the harshness of existence here in London and how interactions work and on which level, and the disregard for many things that I love that you kind of are going back to science, but science says over and over again what are the ideal dimensions for humanity to develop in a constructive way. And it's very fascinating to me. It has been very fascinating to me to observe how strong level of disregard there is for that in bigger cities. And not just in fashion industry. I mean, fashion industry is one of the more extreme spaces, but that kind of parades everywhere. You kind of hear a lot of stories about a lot of things. So I think in that context, I thought that I came to London with a lot of energy, and I was ready to I don't know, make it. Maybe that's the correct word, but definitely utilize this energy that I have to push in a different direction. But that energy ended up imploding on me, and this whole dimension of human experience with what I was able to observe and how I was able to read that chart, in the sense that I've experienced humanity only through quite extreme darkness. How, for example, my search for friends as opposed to, for example, collaborators. I think in London, in big cities, people have learned to collaborate in different degrees, but they had friends. That's a whole different dimension. But like how that search for social warmth, not necessarily acceptance, but social warmth, kind of clashes with how the city on its own work, and then my own interpretation of that narrative, and how that kind of leads to me understanding that the barriers that I thought that I had were quite paper thin, and that whole darkness, with the amount of energy that I had, kind of falls upon me and just glues me to the ground.
So is this where we can say that maybe for the first time, it's wrong to say for the first time, but is this a place where we can maybe say that the pressure started to come back, and this also brought with it a lot of incidents from earlier in life, from the periods like war, etc.? and brought all of these emotions into the concoction as well.
Yeah, I mean, that dimension of trauma came creeping from nowhere, and I broke. And I smile now because I find it's very fascinating, because the signs were there, but it's not as obvious to us when we live them. But what is fascinating, why art? I think that is the mention, kind of like how this whole brick road, how one follows it and how it pans out, kind of again us begging that question of free will. How it pans out is that when I encounter art in London for the first time in that dimension, I also encounter a language that is connected to art. I encounter the press releases, I encounter narratives that I have searched for in Norway but never managed to touch upon. It's like some things, it don't cross roads until, well, I think until the life creates space for that. But why I connected to art is that dimension of the visual experience connected to the language that was utilized to describe. And I think that language was so familiar to me because I have been trained in psychoanalysis from very early age. And it's that connection that offered a promise of transcendence. And I think art is very, very gorgeous as such. And I think that is why art should be looked upon with that degree of reverence as it is. Although I see that constantly breaking, but yes. But remind me what I was talking about.
We were speaking about how art
And language.
and language, yes.
How does that dimension pan out? So art, through the ability to connect the output with the language, offers a very interesting insight into the human psyche, or the psyche of an artist, but also the psyche of the society this artist it lives. I'm not sure, like, it's so annoying because you're so inclined to say he, but artist as much as a female and as much as all the other genders that people identify with. So art offers this dimension of transcendence in such a different way than any other endeavor, and it offers insight to such a degree that it's far superior to anything. So within that, I saw the promise of transcendence that I so sorely needed, because at this point I understood that I was highly split and I could not see bridges in between. On one side, I had this energy that was just dragging me forward and being quite brutal towards me for me breaking. And on the other side, I was glued to the ground, and my lacking comprehension of what has happened and how it has happened, together with that promise that I felt art offered, I took art upon that promise, and now we're here.
I feel that for you, like, is it true that art sort of, you had a lot of questions, you had a lot of things you thought through, you were very drawn to philosophy, etc., and you felt that art sort of addressed these conversations on a different level than most of the other things you have engaged with before?
Do you know what? I find art very beautiful because I find, again, we're kind of going to that dimension of sensing. And I think artists, as an artist, you kind of become hypersensitive. All of our in different dimensions. Connectivity with your own body and implication of meaning are lying to you much more readily available to to interpret. Always looked upon it in a social context, but I've never looked upon me as an individual within that social body. So, however, I'm hypersensitive to how micro dimensions of this on the social levels kind of pan out on a larger scale. So I think with art, it's very fascinating how people create these things. And for me, these objects have a very clear resonance. They give me a sense perception that is flavored, nuanced, and however, how that ties to a language where one is explained what, not necessarily explained, but how that narrative kind of pans out into that connection where you see A and you experience A, and then you see B, or like the language that is much more readily available for people to understand, how that connects and how that acts as a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is actually what I found very fascinating. And I think, like, because it pans out to consciousness, and I think art, and this is kind of why I say that, like, art kind of suffers from inferiority complex to the science, because it is that dimension of consciousness of art almost like existing as a measure of consciousness that becomes very fascinating to me. However, I have to say that for all the artists that are kind of rushing into science, and it's great for people to collaborate across fields. It's absolutely fantastic. But I think what makes an artist is not the amount of scientific knowledge you manage to implement in your work, but what that work means to you, and that how that work allows you to develop as a being, and how it allows your being to develop.
And it's also an investigation of questions, because there's many ways to investigate a question. It's not necessarily always the scientific way. Just you can in many ways get inspiration from the scientific way, but art still often is a question or a topic that is being investigating through different means or mediums than perhaps what the scientific one will be.
Yes, I mean, we're kind of going back to Plato, that famously absolutely hated artists. And I think sometimes artists have this stigma connected to that. But actually, however, I see art as a like hyper individual, not individual, but a discipline on its own. Even without the scientific or philosophical dimension. And what I mean by that is that art, if we go to Laco caves, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, art acts as the first as the first instance of evolving consciousness due to the nature of inscription. And that's the most fascinating dimension of art. If we go back to the caves and the cave doodlings, number one, I will say something and you will have to Google why is that so, but most of the paintings found in caves are found further, like deeper in the caves. It's where it's not rare occurrence that they are at the entrances or through the preliminary hallways, but most of the art is hidden in the depths. And I think that's very interesting dimension, because these levels of oxygen have something to do with all of that. But what is fascinating to me is that the art and that inscription becomes the first trace of a system, of a humanoid system, of a living system, doing something outside its physiological and biological need.
Yes, it is no longer an action done to survive.
Exactly. So it becomes a creative act. And for us, creativity is something that humans have a definitely complicated relationship with that, I think, and it's also interesting how that creativity is also kind of almost like acts as a measure of developed countries, because creativity, where creativity is highly lauded, to put it like this, like this in Serbia, oh my God, if you're an artist, I think your parents. I think that yes, I mean,
You could say that creativity is something. It is definitely something that is more widespread and much more available in the Western world, since society has come to such a place that in many layers, not all layers of society, but in many layers of society, the there is you are sort of secure in your place to a certain degree, which gives more room and time to investigate creativity to a different level than you would if you had to constantly be thinking and making plans for your survival.
exactly, but it's valued in a different way, and it's not only context to survival, because obviously art is also connected to very to very to the communities affected by social and economical lack. So art is connected to those communities in the West as well, But I think people have quite at one point really opened their eyes to what art is, like that art exists as an act of unconscious that kind of pushes itself through and manifests itself in this way, is something. It's a thought pattern that is valued in developed countries, because as you say, in the undeveloped countries, this does not, like this dimension of existence does not, it's not connected to that. And
Well, you at least need to have reached a certain base level before this can start to. Like, there's a lot of cultures, and there's a lot of places all over the world where there's a lot of fantastic art, and like art is being shown. But it always
yes,
show that a sort of base level has been reached, like certain needs have been taken care of before that probably manifest.
yes, definitely, or at least on a larger scale. Obviously, there are always these individuals that are born artists from the very onset.
They had no choice.
They had no their free will, that act of free will was manifested through a different dimension. But what is fascinating to me is that art acts as such. It acts as something unconscious pushing through. And I'm currently working on the book on Origin of Life, that kind of really addresses that dimension of transcendence between inanimate and animate. So for me, to actually see a process of further human development that is not anchored in physiological need or the need for survival, and that can be traced as such, that's a gorgeous moment in human history, and we have documents of it. So we have documents saying that this is valuable, this has happened, because that first act of inscription, that first, like a system, a humanoid system, and again, I'm very compelled to say an early humanoid picking up something that has ability to leave traces on a solid surface, picking that up and then inscribing that voluntarily, is a fascinating thing. It's very, very fascinating, because it says something about the evolution itself.
I also have to say, though, that I'm also fascinated by that the means that was chosen for these specific artworks is one that is also extremely durable.
Yes.
Because it is actually inscribed in such a way that we can enjoy it now, which means that there was definitely put some sort of thought into preservation or perseverance of these pictures, because they could have just used a stick that was salted from the fire.
But I think that's what they use.
Yeah, they use that as well, but it's also carved into the stone.
Stone, yes,
which means
yes.
that it's a very durable thing. They could have done it so it was much more.
But it's also that dimension of something being carved into something, like you use a system utilizing brute force, like that something is so of such an importance that one is utilizing brute force to carve it into, to move solid matter, Like there's so much to unpack here.
And it's also a lot higher energy expenditure into knocking it into rock compared to painting it on with some sort of mixture that would just be a painting on the wall for a while, but then it would disappear.
I think what I find very fascinating with all of that is that those early drawings are quite accurate depictions. They were they weren't realists, but they're definitely yes.
It seemed to be a lot of things that is from their everyday, or not from their everyday, but from their surroundings, things they have seen. They depict things from their life,
but they've
right?
depicted them quite realistically. So that kind of again shows this level of, or it can show, if we believe the traditional historical narrative, it depicts an eye-hand coordination that is on the level of as the modern humans is. And that's fascinating. Like that's fascinating dimension to me. So me panning, like given the trajectory that I've had, me going into art is sometimes it does feel inevitable. It does feel like this was something that I was definitely created for. And I think even when I kind of arrived in London to work in fashion, the treatment that I received because of that dimension, because I was an influencer, that was something that was looked very down upon. It's very fascinating that a community that should be quite liberal was the one that was actually the most judgmental. How that whole dimension ended up pushing me into the place where I'm now, where I've made art, I'm making art, having my discussions for and against society, and I'm working on a book on origin of life. And I couldn't imagine this life, and yet it seems so inevitable.
Seems like that's what it was leading towards.
Yes. And I think with that, dear people, we are going to conclude today's our introductory and first episode. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Christian, for being great.